The Mafia boss watched the black maid protect his daughter from a storm and understood a strength he misjudged. Lila Johnson was no stranger to hardship. She had spent years working in the service of the Castellano family, always in the background, always invisible. Yet, today was different. A fierce storm was raging outside, the sky a dark, thunderous gray. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the grand Castellano mansion. Inside, the temperature was cold, but not from the storm. No, it was the fear in the air that made the house feel so empty. Lila stood in the hallway, her eyes locked on the door leading to Sophia's room. The young girl, Dominic Castellano's daughter, was terrified of the storm. Lila could hear her small sobs through the thick wood, and the sound twisted something deep inside her. Sophia, usually so full of energy, was now a frightened child, alone in her room. Without thinking, Lila pushed open the door and stepped inside. Sophia was huddled in the corner, her little arms wrapped tightly around her knees, eyes wide with panic as thunder shook the house. Lila's heart ached. She had seen Sophia grow up over the past few years, and though she had always maintained a professional distance, there was a bond there, a protective instinct that she couldn't ignore. Lila knelt down beside Sophia, her voice gentle, soothing. "It's okay, Sophia. You're safe here. I'll stay with you until the storm passes." She placed a warm hand on the girl's back, hoping to offer some comfort. The storm outside seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Sophia shivered as a particularly loud crack of thunder sent her into another wave of fear. Lila wrapped her arms around the little girl, pulling her close. "I know it's scary," Lila whispered, her voice soft but firm. "But you're not alone. I'm right here with you, and we're going to be okay." As the wind howled louder, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Dominic Castellano, Sophia's father, the Mafia boss who ruled with a reputation as cold and unforgiving as the storm outside. He had been watching from the hallway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. For a moment, Lila feared that he would reprimand her for breaking the rules that had always kept her in the background, unseen and unheard. But instead, something in his expression softened, and he stepped into the room. He watched quietly as Lila continued to comfort Sophia, her calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos outside. For the first time, Dominic Castellano saw something in Lila that he had never considered before, a strength, a quiet power that was not defined by wealth or status, but by a fierce, unshakable devotion. He watched as Lila rocked Sophia gently, her words a steady stream of comfort as the storm raged on outside. In that moment, Dominic understood that Lila was far more than just the maid. She was a protector, a figure of strength who had been silently safeguarding his family in ways he had never truly appreciated. He misjudged her, and as the storm outside began to subside, Dominic's perception of Lila changed forever. The storm outside had slowly begun to die down, its once deafening roar now reduced to a distant murmur, like a memory fading with time. Inside the room, the tension still hung in the air, thick and heavy, but something had changed. Lila remained kneeling beside Sophia, her hand gently brushing the girl's hair as she whispered soft reassurances. The dark sky outside was clearing, and the light of a late afternoon sun began to filter through the cracks in the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Lila had always been the silent protector, the invisible presence in the Castellano mansion. Her job was clear. Keep her head down, follow the rules, and do her work without question. She was there to serve, nothing more. But in that moment, as she held Sophia in her arms, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was her calling. Sophia's sobs had quieted, but the little girl still clung to Lila as if the world outside was too dangerous to face alone. And as the storm subsided, so did the walls around Dominic Castellano. He stood silently at the doorway, his sharp eyes following every movement Lila made, his thoughts a turbulent whirl of confusion and new understanding. He had always seen Lila as nothing more than a maid, just another face in the sea of employees who worked for his family. She was quiet, diligent, and kept to herself, never daring to step beyond her role. But as he watched her now, his perspective began to unravel. The way she held Sophia, the way she calmed her with such natural ease. It was like watching a mother with her child. But it was more than that. Lila wasn't just comforting Sophia. She was protecting her in a way he had never anticipated. And as the storm outside finally came to a halt, Dominic realized something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. He had misjudged Lila. In his world, power was everything. The Castellano name alone commanded respect, and fear was a tool he used with expert precision. But standing there in that room, watching Lila, a woman who had no wealth, no power, no influence in his world, he felt something he rarely did: vulnerability. She was showing him a side of the world he had long ignored, a side that had nothing to do with money, control, or dominance. It was a side of raw, unspoken strength, strength that didn't come from weapons or wealth, but from something much deeper. Lila didn't need to be loud or forceful to show her power. Her quiet strength came from her actions, her ability to give, to protect, to love without expecting anything in return. For a moment, Dominic couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. He had seen countless acts of loyalty and service in his life, but none quite like this. He stepped further into the room, his heavy footsteps breaking the silence. Lila didn't look up immediately, as if the sound of his approach had no impact on her. She was focused entirely on Sophia, and for a brief moment, Dominic felt an unfamiliar pang of respect for her. "Lila," he said, his voice softer than usual, as he approached them both. Lila looked up slowly, her expression guarded, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet recognition. "Is she all right?" Dominic asked, though the concern in his voice was more than he'd intended. "She's calming down," Lila replied quietly. "The storm's over. She's going to be fine." Dominic nodded, his gaze lingering on Lila for a moment longer than usual. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was laced with something that felt unfamiliar to him: sincerity. Lila's eyes flickered up to meet his, her expression unreadable, but she nodded in acknowledgement. For a moment, the weight of his words seemed to hang in the air. Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss who never showed weakness, who had built his empire on fear and respect, was now standing before Lila, a maid, with nothing but gratitude. "You're welcome, sir," Lila said, her voice steady but soft. She stood up carefully, still holding Sophia close, making sure the little girl was secure before letting her go. Sophia looked up at Lila with wide eyes, her fear from the storm finally fading. Dominic noticed the subtle change in Sophia's demeanor, how the child seemed comforted, how her once fearful expression had softened. In that moment, he realized just how much Lila had done, not just for Sophia, but for him as well. He had misjudged her, had reduced her to nothing more than a background figure in his life, someone who existed to serve him and his family. But now, in the wake of this storm, he saw her for what she truly was, more than just a maid. She was a force, a quiet force of nature that could move mountains with her heart, a heart that wasn't bound by the rules of power and privilege. As Dominic stood there, watching Lila, something inside him began to shift. He had built his life on the understanding that strength was shown through dominance, through control. But in this moment, as he observed Lila's unspoken power, he realized that there was more to strength than what he had known. For the first time, Dominic Castellano felt a deep, unsettling sense of humility. He had misjudged Lila, and now, as he looked at her, he felt an unfamiliar gratitude. He felt, for the first time, that she had given him something he hadn't known he needed, a glimpse into a world of compassion, of strength that wasn't built on fear or violence, but on something much purer. And as the sun began to break through the clouds, casting a soft golden light into the room, Dominic Castellano knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Lila had changed him in ways he couldn't fully understand, but he knew that from this moment on, he would never see her, or the world, in the same way again. The days that followed the storm were quieter, yet something had irrevocably changed in the Castellano mansion. Dominic found himself observing Lila with a newfound respect, though he didn't fully understand why. She moved through the house with the same grace as always, but now he saw her differently. She wasn't just a maid, she was something more, something deeper. He noticed the way she interacted with Sophia, the tenderness in her voice, the way her eyes softened whenever the little girl needed reassurance. She wasn't just doing her job. She was genuinely caring for Sophia, protecting her in a way he never expected. It was a stark contrast to the world Dominic had built, where strength was measured by power, wealth, and control. Lila's strength was different. It was quiet, unassuming, yet undeniable. Dominic didn't understand it, but he couldn't help but admire it. One evening, after dinner, he found himself alone in the library, staring at the stack of papers on his desk. His mind kept drifting back to Lila. He had always been in control of every situation, every person. He had built his empire on the idea that power could be held with an iron fist. But now, he was questioning everything. The knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was Lila, standing in the doorway with her usual calm demeanor. "Mr. Castellano," she began, her voice steady. "I was wondering if you needed anything before I head off for the night." Dominic looked at her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. "No, Lila," he replied, his voice surprisingly soft. "Thank you." She nodded, her expression unreadable, but he saw something there. Something that wasn't just the professional distance she had always kept. There was a flicker of something more, something that felt like a bridge being built between them. Lila turned to leave, but Dominic stopped her. "Lila," he called, and she turned back to face him. "Why do you do it?" The question seemed to hang in the air, unexpected and unfamiliar. Lila's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't hesitate. "Do what, sir? Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice almost questioning himself as much as her. "About Sophia. About everything." Lila stood still for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "Because it's what I do," she said simply. "It's what I've always done. I take care of people. It's who I am." Her answer was so simple, yet it struck Dominic with an unexpected force. "And what about you, Lila?" he asked, a hint of something like concern creeping into his voice. "Who takes care of you?" She paused, her eyes meeting his for the briefest moment. "I take care of myself, Mr. Castellano," she said softly. There was a quiet strength in her words, a calmness that spoke of years of hardship, of resilience. Dominic felt a strange feeling settle in his chest. He had seen many people in his life, seen them cower, seen them beg, but Lila was different. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't demand attention or accolades. She simply gave. And in that giving, she had earned his respect in a way no one else had ever managed. The silence between them stretched, and for a moment, Dominic found himself at a loss for words. He wanted to say something, to explain what he was feeling, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at Lila. She stood there for a moment longer, then gave a small nod in return before turning to leave. As she walked out of the room, Dominic couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted. He had always prided himself on being in control, on understanding the world and the people around him. But Lila had thrown that understanding into question. She was a reminder that there was more to life than just power and control. She reminded him that there were people who cared for others, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because it was who they were. And in that quiet, unassuming way, Lila had shown him a strength that he couldn't ignore. The next few days were a blur of work and meetings, but Dominic couldn't shake the image of Lila from his mind. She was everywhere, caring for Sophia, keeping the house in order, quietly ensuring that everything ran smoothly. But now, he saw her differently. He saw the depth in her, the quiet strength that had always been there but that he had never truly noticed. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Dominic found himself walking toward the garden. He had been avoiding the house lately, not wanting to confront the feelings that were beginning to bubble to the surface. But tonight, something was different. He needed to see her, to talk to her, to understand what had changed inside him. As he walked through the garden, he saw Lila standing by the fountain, her back to him as she looked out over the water. The soft glow of the setting sun cast a warm light over her, and for a moment, she seemed almost ethereal, like she belonged to a different world. Dominic approached quietly, unsure of what he would say. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, to feeling unsure of himself, but in her presence, it was impossible to deny. "Lila," he called softly, and she turned to face him, her expression neutral but her eyes warm. "Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice calm. "Is everything all right?" Dominic hesitated for a moment before answering. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "About you. About everything you've done for this family." Lila raised an eyebrow but didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. "You've shown me something I never expected," Dominic said slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "You've shown me a strength that I didn't understand before. Lila's expression softened slightly, but she said nothing, allowing him to continue. I've spent my life believing that strength comes from power, from control. But you've shown me that there's a different kind of strength. A strength that comes from love, from care, from giving without expecting anything in return. He paused, as if the weight of his words had caught up with him. I've been wrong about you, Lila. I see that now. Lila looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, but there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. It's never been about proving anything to you, Mr. Castellano, she said quietly. It's just who I am. Dominic stood there in silence, the truth of her words sinking in. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly see someone. Not for their role, not for their status, but for who they truly were. The following days were filled with a strange tension. It was as though the air itself had shifted in the Castellano mansion. Dominic found himself thinking about Lila more often than he cared to admit. He couldn't get the image of her holding Sophia in her arms, her calm demeanor in the face of the storm, out of his mind. The way she had protected his daughter without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, it was a kind of strength he hadn't known existed. He was used to people obeying him out of fear, people bending to his will because of his wealth, his status, his power. But Lila, she didn't operate that way. She was different, and that difference had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. He caught himself observing her from time to time, watching her as she moved through the mansion, her presence quiet yet commanding in its own way. She was the embodiment of something he couldn't quite place, something that seemed so simple yet so profound. One evening, after dinner, as he walked through the grand hallway of his mansion, Dominic found himself heading toward the library. The house was unusually quiet, the staff already finishing their duties for the night. He could hear the soft sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, and when he turned the corner, he saw Lila walking toward him, a tray of freshly cleaned glasses in her hands. She stopped when she saw him, her expression neutral as always. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," she said politely, her voice steady. Dominic nodded, his eyes studying her for a moment. "Lila, there's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, his tone different from usual. Lila paused, a small flicker of curiosity crossing her face. "Yes, sir." "Why do you do it?" he asked, the words coming out more quietly than he intended. "Why do you care so much about Sophia? About this family?" Lila shifted the tray in her hands, her gaze steady. "Because it's what I do, sir," she said softly. "It's who I am." Dominic didn't know how to respond to that. He had asked the question out of genuine curiosity, but now that he heard her answer, it left him with more questions than answers. Why did she do it? What was it about her that made her so different from the others? "You've been here for years, Lila," he said, his voice a little softer now. "Why don't you ever ask for anything in return?" Lila met his gaze then, and for the first time, he saw something more in her eyes, something beyond the quiet, dutiful maid. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Mr. Castellano," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm here to do what needs to be done. That's enough for me." There was a sincerity in her words, an honesty that cut through the usual guarded walls Dominic had built around himself. It was a humbling answer, and for the first time, he realized just how much he had taken her for granted. He had never truly seen her, not until that moment. He had never asked himself what made Lila tick, what drove her to care so deeply about the people around her, to put their needs before her own. In his world, that was something rare, almost impossible to understand. "You're different," Dominic said after a long pause. "You don't think like the rest of us." Lila didn't respond immediately, her gaze never wavering. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. "But I think, sometimes it's the people who don't seek power, who don't need it, that have the most strength." Dominic blinked, struck by her words. It was a sentiment he had never considered, and in that moment, it felt like a revelation. Strength wasn't just about controlling others, about having power over them. It was about something deeper, something more enduring. "I never thought about it like that," Dominic admitted, his voice almost a whisper. Lila gave him a small nod, a slight shift in her posture that made her seem less like an employee and more like someone who truly understood the world in a way that he didn't. She didn't ask for anything from him, didn't need anything from him. She simply existed, quietly, doing her part, living by a set of values he couldn't quite grasp. And in that, there was something both humbling and powerful. As the night wore on, Dominic found himself thinking about their conversation. Lila's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in a long time, he felt uncertain. Uncertain about his world, about his beliefs, and about what truly mattered. He had always believed that strength came from the top, from the position of power, from being in control. But Lila had shown him that true strength came from something different, something more enduring and selfless. As the days passed, Dominic's feelings toward Lila continued to evolve. He began to look at her differently, not as a servant or an employee, but as a person who had quietly infiltrated his life, teaching him lessons he never thought he needed to learn. He had misjudged her, assuming that because she was in a position of service, she was weak. But in truth, it was he who had been weak, hiding behind his power, too. Afraid to let go and let others show him what it meant to truly care. It was in the small, everyday moments with Lila that he found the strength he had been searching for. She had shown him that true power wasn't about control or dominance. It was about kindness, compassion, and the willingness to put others first. Dominic didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Lila had changed him in ways he couldn't yet understand, but he was determined to try. The days following their conversation in the garden felt different for both Dominic and Lila. For Dominic, the change was subtle at first, an unease he couldn't quite place, a constant stirring in his mind as he reflected on the quiet strength Lila had shown him. His usual sense of control, the ever-present certainty that he understood how the world worked, had begun to unravel. He found himself questioning his actions, his decisions, and the way he had always viewed the people around him. He was used to power being something tangible, something that could be controlled, manipulated. But Lila's strength had come from a place he couldn't control, and that realization had shaken him. He had spent his life accumulating power, believing it was the only way to secure his position in the world. But Lila had shown him that true power didn't come from force or dominance. It came from the ability to care, to protect, to give without asking for anything in return. He had misjudged her, and now he was grappling with the idea that there were things in life more important than wealth or control. Lila, on the other hand, had sensed the change in Dominic as well. He was different now, not just in the way he looked at her, but in his demeanor, in the way he moved through the mansion, like someone who had suddenly become aware of things he had previously ignored. She didn't know exactly what had caused this shift in him, but she felt it. And while she had always remained distant, focused on her role in the Castellano family, she couldn't deny that something in Dominic's transformation stirred something in her, too. She saw him more clearly now, not just as the powerful Mafia boss he had always been, but as a man struggling with his own realizations about what really mattered in life. But Lila wasn't sure what to do with this new dynamic between them. She had never asked for his attention, never sought to change the way he viewed her. Her life had always been about survival, about doing her job and keeping her distance. But now, as she saw Dominic change before her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder where this would lead. One evening, after a long day of tending to the house in Sofia, Lila found herself in the kitchen, preparing a late dinner for herself. The mansion was quiet, the staff having finished their work for the night. The soft sound of her chopping vegetables was the only noise in the otherwise silent house. Just as she was about to put the vegetables into a pot, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Lila," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Lila paused, a sense of unease settling over her. She had never expected this. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice steady but cautious. Dominic stepped into the kitchen, his eyes locking with hers. There was a tension in the air, a quiet anticipation that neither of them could ignore. "I've been thinking," Dominic began, his voice quieter than usual. "About everything. About what you said in the garden. About how I've been living my life." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "I don't know if I ever truly understood what strength really was until now," Dominic continued, his gaze softening. "I always thought it was about power, about being in control, having everything in your grasp. But you've shown me that there's more to strength than that. It's about how much you care for the people around you. It's about protecting them, even when you have nothing to gain in return. Lila didn't know what to say. She had always kept her distance, always remained silent in the face of his power, never expecting anything more. But hearing him say these words, hearing the sincerity in his voice, stirred something deep inside her. I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, Dominic said, his voice tinged with regret. But I've come to realize that some things can't be controlled. Some things are just stronger than anything I could ever try to dominate. He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, Lila. And I'm sorry for that. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected this, never thought that the powerful man she had served would ever apologize to her. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before, a vulnerability, an openness that made her feel both honored and uncomfortable. You've changed, Dominic, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. You're different now. He nodded slowly. I'm trying to be. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I can't keep living the way I have been. I can't keep hiding behind my power, pretending that it's all that matters. Lila didn't know how to respond to that. She had always been content with her place in the Castellano family, quiet, invisible, and without expectation. But now, as she looked at Dominic, she realized that things had shifted, that they were no longer just the boss and the maid. There was something else between them, something unspoken but undeniable. You've done something to me, Lila, Dominic said, his voice steady but intense. Something I never expected. And for the first time in a long time, I feel free. Lila's heart raced. She didn't know how to process his words, how to make sense of what was happening between them. She had never asked for his admiration, never sought to change his perception of her. But now, as she stood before him, she realized that everything was different. I didn't mean to change anything, Lila replied softly. I only did what I felt was right. Dominic looked at her, his expression softening further. And that's what makes you stronger than I ever realized. Lila's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, with emotions that neither of them fully understood. But in that silence, Lila realized something. She had never truly seen Dominic for who he was, and now, in this moment, he was seeing her in a way he never had before. And for the first time, she wasn't just the maid. She was something more. The days following their conversation in the kitchen seemed to stretch longer for both Lila and Dominic. The air between them had changed, and though neither of them spoke of it, it was palpable. Dominic was still grappling with the realization that his understanding of strength, of power, had been incomplete all his life. He had spent years building his empire on the assumption that control and fear were the keys to everything. But now, after seeing Lila in a new light, he wasn't so sure. It was as if the foundation of his world had shifted, and he was left trying to make sense of what that meant for him. Lila, too, was struggling with the change. She had always been content in her role. Her quiet, unassuming life at the Castellano mansion had been enough. But now, something had been stirred in her. Dominic had seen her differently, and she had felt that shift. There was no going back. And though she had never asked for anything from him, the way he now looked at her was something new, something both unnerving and, in a strange way, empowering. She continued her duties as always, but every time she crossed paths with him, there was a new awareness in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it was different. One afternoon, after Sophia had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Dominic found himself walking through the mansion, his thoughts heavy. He had been avoiding Lila, unsure of how to approach the situation. He had never been one for uncertainty, and yet, here he was, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't just about power or control anymore. It was something deeper, something he hadn't expected to confront. He found himself outside the kitchen, where he knew Lila would be. The soft glow of the overhead lights illuminated the room, casting a warm, almost inviting atmosphere. Lila was in the middle of preparing a simple meal for herself, the rhythmic sound of her chopping vegetables filling the silence. As Dominic stepped into the kitchen, he noticed how at ease she seemed, how natural she appeared in this space that had always felt so alien to him. Lila didn't turn around when she heard his footsteps. She didn't need to. She knew it was him. She always knew. Lila, Dominic said, his voice steady but carrying an unspoken weight. She paused, the knife in her hand stilling for a moment as she looked over her shoulder at him. "Yes, sir," she responded, her voice calm but with a hint of curiosity. "I've been thinking," he began, his words coming slower than usual. "About everything. About what you said. And about what I've learned." He was still figuring out how to say it, how to put into words the shift that had occurred inside him. "What you said about strength, it's not something I had ever considered before. Not in the way you meant it." Lila set down the knife and turned fully to face him. She was surprised. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again. But she didn't speak. She just waited, her gaze steady, her expression open. "I've spent so much of my life building this empire. This world where control means everything," Dominic continued, his voice a little more vulnerable than usual. "But now, I see that it's not control that matters. It's something else. It's what you showed me. It's how much you give, how much you care, without ever asking for anything in return. And he hesitated, as though trying to find the right words. "I see now that I've been wrong. Wrong about a lot of things." There was a long silence between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lila stood there, unmoving, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected an apology, nor had she ever wanted one. She had always known who she was and what her role was in the Castellano family. But hearing him speak this way, seeing the change in his demeanor, made her feel something she hadn't expected: respect. "I've been thinking a lot, too," Lila said finally, breaking the silence. "About what you said about me." Dominic looked at her, his eyes searching her face, trying to read her expression. "And?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "And?" She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "I don't need anything from you. I've never needed anything from you. I do what I do because it's what I believe in. It's not about your approval or your gratitude. It's just who I am." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Dominic felt a strange warmth in his chest as he listened. He had always admired people who were unapologetically themselves, but hearing it from her, from Lila, made him realize just how rare that was. She wasn't trying to impress him, to gain his favor. She was simply existing in a way that was pure, untainted by the rules of the world he had built. "I think that's what makes you different," Dominic said quietly. "You don't need anything from me. You don't need anything from anyone. And yet, you give so much." Lila didn't respond immediately, her gaze steady and calm. She had always kept herself distant, had always maintained a certain boundary. But now, as she looked at him, she felt something shift. It wasn't just about power or position anymore. It was about something deeper, something they both shared, a recognition of strength in each other, even if they didn't fully understand it. "I've never asked for your help, sir," Lila said softly, her tone firm. "And I never will. But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate your kindness. It just means that I do things my way." Dominic nodded, the weight of her words settling into his chest. "I understand," he said, his voice quieter now. "I think I'm starting to understand a lot of things." For the first time in their interactions, there was no tension, no hidden agendas. Just a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but clear. Lila returned to her work, picking up the knife again and resuming her task. Dominic stood there for a moment, watching her. He felt something stir inside him, a mix of respect and something deeper, something he couldn't name yet. But in that moment, he realized something. Lila had given him more than he could ever repay. She had shown him the strength he had never thought to value, and for that, he would always be grateful. The days seemed to pass more quickly now, as if the quiet tension that had once filled the air in the Castellano mansion had been replaced by something softer. Dominic and Lila no longer avoided one another, but there was still a palpable distance between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Dominic found himself reflecting on his past actions, his decisions, and how he had viewed the people around him. The shift in his perspective was subtle but profound. He no longer saw Lila as just the maid, the employee who filled a role in his house. He saw her as someone with her own strength, her own purpose. Lila, too, felt the change, though she had never expected it. She had always been content in her place, quiet and unseen, and while she had never asked for anything, she couldn't ignore the way Dominic had begun to look at her differently. There was no longer a sense of power between them, no walls to hide behind. It was just the two of them, connected by something neither fully understood yet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dominic found himself standing outside on the balcony, looking out over the estate. The air was cool, the soft rustle of the trees in the distance almost comforting. He had been thinking a lot about his family, about the legacy he was building, and about the role Lila had unexpectedly played in his life. He had spent so many years building his empire on the idea that power was the only thing that mattered. But now, after everything that had happened, he realized how flawed that belief was. Power couldn't buy loyalty. It couldn't buy kindness. It couldn't buy the kind of strength Lila had shown him. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Lila standing in the doorway, her expression calm as always, but her eyes were searching, as if looking for something in his. "Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Dominic shook his head. "Not at all, Lila. Come join me." Lila hesitated for a moment before stepping outside, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She stood beside him, both of them gazing out over the estate in silence for a moment. "It's beautiful out here," Lila said softly, her gaze fixed on the view. "Yes," Dominic agreed, his voice low. "It is." The silence between them felt natural, comfortable in a way that it hadn't before. It wasn't awkward, nor was it heavy. It was just the two of them, standing together, each lost in their own thoughts. After a few moments, Dominic spoke again. "Lila, I've been thinking." Lila turned to look at him, her brow slightly furrowed. "About what?" "About everything," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "About how I've been living my life, about the things I've valued, and about the things I've overlooked." He paused, his gaze finally meeting hers. "I've overlooked you, Lila. For so long. I've seen you as just another part of this house, just another employee. But I realize now that I've been wrong." Lila's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never expected an apology, nor had she ever thought she needed one. She had always been content with her role. But hearing him say those words, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, stirred something inside her. "You've never asked for anything from me," Dominic continued, his voice almost thoughtful. "You've never expected anything in return for everything you do for this family. And I don't think I've ever truly appreciated that." Lila didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure what he wanted from her, what he was hoping to hear. But something inside her softened as she looked at him. He wasn't asking for her approval or her forgiveness. He was simply acknowledging the truth. "I've been living my life all wrong," Dominic said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "I've been so focused on power, on control, that I never realized what truly matters. What matters is the people who care about you, who show up for you when you least expect it. What matters is the strength that comes from kindness, from loyalty, from giving without expecting anything in return." Lila felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never heard Dominic speak this way, never seen him so open, so vulnerable. It was a side of him that she hadn't known existed, a side that made her see him in a new light. "I was wrong to treat you as just someone who worked for me," Dominic said, his voice quiet. "I see that now. And I'm sorry, Lila. I'm truly sorry." The apology was simple, but it was genuine. Lila didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her eyes meeting his. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to apologize." Dominic looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it carried a weight of unspoken understanding. "No, Lila," he said quietly. "I do. I owe you more than an apology." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Lila didn't know how to respond. She had never expected this moment, never imagined that Dominic Castellano, the powerful Mafia boss, would ever say such things to her. But in that moment, she realized that this was the first time in a long time that she felt truly seen. Not as a servant, not as someone who was beneath him, but as a person who had made a difference in his life without even trying. Dominic's hand remained on her shoulder for a moment longer before he slowly withdrew it. He took a step back, his gaze still fixed on her. "Thank you, Lila," he said, his voice softer now. "For everything." Lila didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded again. She didn't need to hear more. The sincerity in his words was enough. And as they stood there together, the mansion around them quiet and still, Lila felt something shift within her. She had always known that she didn't need anything from him, but in this moment, she realized that Dominic Castellano had given her something she had never expected: his respect, his gratitude, and his acknowledgement. And that, she realized, was more than enough. The weeks that followed the moment on the balcony felt like a quiet turning point. Lila continued her duties as always, her presence calm and steady. She had always been a quiet force in the Castellano household, but now, something had changed. Dominic's words, his apology, had lingered in her mind, though she didn't dwell on them. She had never needed his recognition, but to hear him say that he respected her, that he acknowledged her strength, was something she hadn't expected. And yet, it felt right. Dominic, too, felt the change. It wasn't something he could pinpoint exactly, but it was there, an undeniable shift in how he saw everything around him. He found himself thinking about Lila more than he cared to admit. His mind would often wander to their conversation in the kitchen, to the look in her eyes when she had said, "It's not about your approval, it's just who I am." He had always prided himself on being a man of power, a man who controlled everything in his world. But Lila had shown him that there were other forms of strength, forms he had never given much thought to. As he walked through the mansion one evening, lost in thought, he found himself drawn to the familiar sight of Lila in the hallway, her steps graceful and sure. He paused for a moment, just watching her. She didn't notice him right away, her focus entirely on the task at hand as she walked past him. When she did finally look up and see him standing there, she gave him a small, polite nod, as though nothing had changed. But Dominic couldn't ignore the change in the air. She wasn't just the maid anymore, not in his eyes. She was someone different, someone who had carved out a place in his world without ever asking for it. "Lila," he said, his voice soft but firm. She stopped, looking up at him, her expression neutral but curious. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice as calm as ever. Dominic hesitated for a moment, unsure of what exactly he wanted to say. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic statement. It was just a simple truth that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an unfamiliar weight. "About everything. About the way I've always seen things, and the way I've seen you. I realize now that I've been wrong." Lila didn't respond immediately. She simply waited, her eyes steady as she watched him, as if giving him the space to speak. "I've always seen strength as something that comes from control," he continued, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting hers again. "But you've shown me that strength doesn't always come from control. Sometimes, it comes from letting go, from showing kindness, from protecting others without expecting anything in return." Lila's breath caught in her throat, her heart beating a little faster at his words. She had never expected this from him. Not the apology, not the admission of his mistake. But there it was, clear as day. Dominic Castellano, the man who had always been in control, was admitting that he had been wrong. "I see you differently now, Lila," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I respect you, and I want you to know that." Lila's heart was pounding in her chest. She had never needed his respect, never expected it. But hearing those words from him, seeing the genuine emotion in his eyes, made something shift inside her. She had always known that she was more than just a maid, more than just a servant in his house. But to hear him say it out loud, to hear him acknowledge her strength, was something she hadn't expected. For a moment, she was silent, unsure of how to respond. But then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You don't need to respect me, Dominic," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I never asked for that. I do what I do because it's the right thing to do, not because I want anything in return." Dominic nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. "I know," he said quietly, "but it doesn't change the fact that I respect you. And I think I always have, even if I didn't realize it." Lila looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but she found none. He was being completely honest with her. And in that moment, she felt something inside her stir, a sense of acceptance, of understanding. Dominic had changed. And in that change, there was a part of her that was finally able to let go of the walls she had built around herself. "I never needed anything from you, Dominic," she said softly. "But I think you've finally seen me for who I am." The words felt like a weight lifted off her shoulders. Dominic smiled then, the expression warm and genuine. "I see you now," he said quietly, "and I'm glad for it. There was a long silence between them, a silence that was no longer uncomfortable or filled with tension. It was a silence of understanding, of mutual respect. And for the first time, Dominic realized that there was no longer a need to keep up the facade of power. He didn't have to control everything around him to feel strong. Lila had shown him that. As they stood there, in the quiet hallway of the mansion, Dominic realized that he had learned more from Lila in the past few weeks than he had in years of running his empire. She had taught him the value of kindness, of giving without expecting anything in return, and most importantly, of truly seeing the people around him. And in that moment, Dominic knew that everything had changed, not just for him, but for both of them. They had both finally found a place of mutual understanding, a place where respect wasn't earned through power, but through something much deeper. And for the first time in his life, Dominic Castellano felt at peace with that. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet transformation in the Castellano mansion seemed to ripple through everything. Dominic and Lila, once confined by unspoken boundaries and expectations, now moved through the house with a new understanding between them. There was no longer any tension, no underlying tension that once simmered in their interactions. There was only respect, a quiet respect that neither of them had sought but had somehow found. Dominic, for the first time in his life, felt something that had eluded him for so long: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from controlling everything around him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from his wealth or his status as the Mafia boss. It was the kind of peace that came from letting go of the need to dominate, from allowing himself to feel vulnerable, to admit that there was more to life than just power. And it was Lila, of all people, who had taught him that. Lila had always been the quiet force in the background of the Castellano family's life. She had never asked for anything from Dominic, never sought his approval or attention. She had always quietly served, always done her job with a sense of duty and grace. But now, as she moved through the mansion, she felt a subtle shift in herself as well. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like she was just someone who was there to serve and nothing more. She had earned Dominic's respect, and with that respect came a kind of recognition that she had never expected. The two of them, despite the difference in their worlds, now understood each other in a way that transcended their roles. It wasn't just about power anymore. It wasn't about control. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them had fully understood until now. One afternoon, as Lila was tending to the garden outside the mansion, Dominic found himself walking toward her. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the sprawling estate. He had been thinking about her, about their conversations, and the more he thought, the more he realized that something had shifted inside him, that he couldn't ignore. He had to tell her. As he approached, Lila looked up, surprised to see him outside. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood up, her expression neutral but polite. "Mr. Castellano," she greeted him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Is there something you need?" Dominic took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he spoke. "Lila," he began, his voice steady but filled with something more. "I've been thinking." Lila raised an eyebrow, a silent invitation for him to continue. "About everything," Dominic said, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "About the changes, about how I've been living my life. And about what you've shown me." Lila's expression softened as she listened, her gaze steady but thoughtful. "You've taught me something, Lila," Dominic continued, taking a step closer. "Something I never thought I needed to learn. You've shown me that power isn't about control. It isn't about dominance or fear. It's about kindness. It's about being able to care for others without expecting anything in return. It's about the strength that comes from love and compassion." Lila stood still, her breath catching in her throat as she processed his words. She had never expected him to say something like this. She had never imagined that the man who had built his empire on fear and power would ever speak of love and compassion in such a way. But here he was, standing before her, admitting that he had been wrong, admitting that he had learned something from her. "I never realized how much strength you have," Dominic said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "You've always been so quiet, so humble, but now I see it. I see the strength that comes from your heart, the way you give without asking for anything in return. It's a strength that I've never truly understood until now." Lila felt a rush of emotion at his words. She had never sought his approval, never expected it. But hearing him speak so honestly, so vulnerably, made something inside her shift. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the maid. She was someone who had made a difference. "You've always had this power over me, Lila," Dominic said, his voice almost a whisper now. "This quiet power that I've always ignored. But I can't ignore it anymore. You've taught me what it means to truly care for someone, to protect them, to give without expecting anything in return. I've never seen that before. And for that, I owe you more than I could ever repay." Lila stood there, speechless for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never expected Dominic to say such things, never imagined that he would admit to learning something from her. She had always seen him as the powerful one, the one who had everything under control. But now, in this moment, she saw a different side of him, a side that was willing to admit that he had been wrong, that he had been changed by something as simple as kindness. "I never needed anything from you, Dominic," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never needed your approval or your gratitude. I've always done what I do because it's the right thing. But hearing you say this, hearing you acknowledge it, it means more than you know." Dominic's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. He wasn't the Mafia boss. He wasn't the powerful man who controlled everything. He was just Dominic, standing before Lila, a man who had learned something important. "I see you now, Lila," Dominic said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I'm grateful for everything you've taught me." Lila met his gaze, her eyes searching his for a moment. There was no fear, no hesitation, just two people who had come to understand each other in a way they never had before. And in that moment, Lila realized that Dominic had truly seen her, not just as the maid, not just as someone who served him, but as someone who had changed his life, who had given him something he never thought he needed. And that realization, more than anything, made her feel truly seen, truly understood. The days following their conversation by the garden felt like a shift had occurred in both of them, though neither of them fully knew how to navigate it. Dominic found himself spending more time in the house, his mind drifting back to the moments of clarity that had emerged over the past few weeks. He had never been one to dwell on feelings or emotions, but now, they seemed to follow him at every turn. The house, once a sanctuary of order and control, now felt different to him, less like a place where he commanded power and more like a place where he could be himself. Lila, too, felt the change. It was subtle, but it was there. She moved through the mansion with a quiet certainty that had always been her hallmark, but now, it seemed different. She wasn't just going through the motions. She felt seen, truly seen, in a way that she had never experienced before. Her role in the Castellano family had always been clear, but now, there was a depth to it that she hadn't expected. And it wasn't just about her job. It was about something deeper, something unspoken that hung between her and Dominic. Something that had started to shift in the quiet spaces of their interactions. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lila stood by the kitchen window, her eyes lost in thought as she watched the light dim outside. It was peaceful here, and yet, she felt a stirring inside of her, a feeling she couldn't quite place. It wasn't unease, but it was something akin to it. She had never allowed herself to question the life she had made in the mansion, but now, with Dominic's words echoing in her mind, she couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. She had always been content with the quiet, steady rhythm of her days, but now there was a part of her that longed for more, a part of her that wanted to understand what had shifted between them. Dominic, too, felt that same stir in the air. He had been more distant lately, lost in his thoughts as he tried to make sense of everything. The mansion felt different, but it wasn't the space that had changed. It was him. He had always been in control, always knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. But now, with Lila in his life, he felt like he was on the edge of something unknown, something that both excited and frightened him. The power he had once relied on, the control he had once clung to, no longer seemed like enough. He had begun to see things differently, starting with her. Lila was the one person in his life who didn't seek anything from him. She didn't want his money, his approval, or his attention. She simply gave quietly, without asking for anything in return. And it was that very thing that had started to unravel his understanding of strength and power. He had spent his entire life building an empire, thinking that dominance was the key to everything. But in Lila's quiet presence, he had discovered a different kind of strength. A strength that came from vulnerability, from caring for others without expecting anything in return. One evening, after a particularly long day, Dominic found himself walking through the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The staff had finished for the night, and the mansion was quiet. He could hear the faint sound of the wind outside, a gentle reminder that the world outside continued on, unaware of the inner turmoil that had begun to stir within him. As he passed by the garden, he saw Lila standing near the fountain, her head tilted slightly upward as she gazed at the sky. The soft light from the moon bathed her in a silver glow, making her look almost ethereal. He paused for a moment, watching her in silence. There was something so peaceful about the way she stood there, as if she were part of the world around her, part of the rhythm of the earth itself. For a brief moment, Dominic allowed himself to simply watch her, to appreciate the quiet strength she exuded. She didn't see him standing there, and for that moment, he was content to remain unseen. But then, as if sensing his presence, Lila turned and looked directly at him, her eyes meeting his across the distance. She didn't say anything at first, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She had felt the shift between them two. Slowly, she walked toward him, her steps measured but graceful. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice calm as always. Dominic smiled slightly, the sound of her voice comforting to him in a way he couldn't explain. "Good evening, Lila," he replied, his tone softer than usual. He took a breath, his gaze lingering on her. "I've been thinking." Lila raised an eyebrow, her expression curious. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady. "About everything," he said quietly, his gaze now fixed on her. "About the changes. About how I've seen you, and how I've seen myself." Lila didn't respond right away. She simply waited, her eyes never leaving his. "You've taught me something," Dominic continued, his voice filled with sincerity. "Something I never thought I would learn. You've shown me that there is more to strength than what I've always known. That sometimes, the greatest strength comes from giving, from caring, from being there for someone without expecting anything in return." Lila felt her heart race at his words. She had never expected Dominic to say something like this. Never imagined he would be standing here, admitting his own vulnerabilities. It was unexpected, and yet it felt right. "I've always thought that power came from control," Dominic said, taking a step closer to her. "But I see now that it comes from something else. It comes from being able to trust, to care. And I realize now that you've shown me what true strength really is." There was a long silence as Lila processed his words. She had always kept her emotions guarded, had always focused on the task at hand. But something in Dominic's words made her feel something shift inside her. He wasn't just the powerful Mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had learned something important. "I never needed anything from you, Dominic," Lila said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never wanted your approval. I've always just wanted to do what's right. But hearing you say this, it means more than you know." Dominic reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he placed it gently on her shoulder. The touch was soft, filled with a kind of understanding that neither of them had expected. "I see you now, Lila," Dominic said quietly. "And I'm grateful for everything you've taught me." Lila looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, she saw him not as the Mafia boss who ruled with power, but as a man who had learned to see the world through a different lens. In that moment, she realized that they had both changed, not just in how they saw each other, but in how they saw themselves. And for the first time, there was no need for anything more. Just two people, standing together, having learned something they never thought they would. The weeks that followed seemed to carry a new sense of balance between Dominic and Lila. The change was not instant, but it was undeniable. The mansion, once filled with the unspoken tension of their roles, now felt more like a place where both of them could exist without the weight of expectation or hierarchy. Dominic had spent years building an empire based on power, fear, and control. But now, in the quiet spaces of the mansion, he was beginning to realize that there was something more to life, something more fulfilling than wealth or dominance. Lila, too, had felt the shift. She had always been content in her place, quietly doing her work and staying out of the spotlight. But now, she felt seen in a way she never had before. Dominic's respect, his acknowledgement of her strength, had opened something in her, a door to a world where she didn't have to hide, where she could be herself without fear of judgment. As days turned into weeks, the change between them grew more apparent. It wasn't just about their interactions, it was about their understanding of each other, of themselves. Dominic had started to seek her out more often, not for business or for anything related to the running of the house, but just to talk. At first, Lila had been uncertain of these new interactions, unsure of what they meant. But gradually, she came to realize that Dominic was no longer the powerful man who had always kept her at a distance. He had become someone she could relate to, a man learning, just like her, what it meant to truly live with compassion. One evening, as autumn set in, the air crisp and cool, Lila was out in the garden, tending to the flowers. It had become one of her favorite places, a quiet space where she could reflect and find peace. The sunset bathed the garden in warm hues of gold and orange, and for a moment, Lila lost herself in the beauty of it all. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her reverie, and she looked up to find Dominic walking toward her. His presence was still commanding, but there was something different in the way he moved now, more relaxed, more at ease. "Lila," he said, his voice steady but not as forceful as it had once been. She smiled softly at him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano." She had never quite known how to address him in the past, but now, it felt natural to call him by his name. "How are you?" Dominic asked, pausing a few feet away from her. Lila looked at him for a moment, then shrugged. "I'm fine," she said simply. "Just enjoying the evening." Dominic nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice softer than usual. Lila raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing him to continue. "About how much has changed," he said quietly, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "I've spent so many years thinking I understood everything. That power, control, was all there was. But now, I realize I've been wrong." Lila tilted her head slightly, listening intently. Dominic paused, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find the right words. "I've been living a life built on fear, on strength that comes from dominance," he said, his voice filled with a quiet honesty. "But you've shown me that there's another way. A way where strength comes from giving, from caring, from being there for people without expecting anything in return." There was a pause, and Lila felt a wave of emotion stir inside her. She had never expected Dominic to speak so openly, so vulnerably. It was as though he was finally shedding the layers that had protected him for so long. "I see you now, Lila," Dominic said softly, his voice steady. "I don't know if I ever truly saw you before. Not for who you really are. But now I do." Lila felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had never needed his recognition, but to hear him speak with such sincerity, to know that he had come to understand her, was something she hadn't expected. It was humbling. It was powerful. "I've been trying to figure out how to change," Dominic continued, his voice low. "Not just for myself, but for the people around me. I don't want to keep living the way I have been. I want to be a better person, a better man." Lila watched him in silence, the weight of his words settling in her heart. For so long, she had kept herself distant, afraid of being seen, afraid of being judged. But now, as she stood in front of Dominic, she realized that she didn't have to hide anymore. He had seen her for who she truly was, and he had accepted her. And in return, he was asking her to see him, not as the Mafia boss, not as the man in charge, but as a person who was willing to change. "I don't expect anything from you, Dominic," Lila said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'm glad to see you realizing what really matters." Dominic looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that she had never heard before. "But I want to try. I want to be someone better, someone who values what really matters, who values people like you." The sincerity in his words hit Lila deeply. It wasn't just an apology, it was an invitation to something more. An invitation to see each other for who they truly were, without the masks they had worn for so long. "You already are better," Lila said softly. Dominic didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so much time trying to be perfect, trying to live up to an image of strength that was all about control. But now, standing here in front of Lila, he realized that true strength wasn't about perfection. It was about being real, about being willing to change, to grow, and to care for others. "Thank you, Lila," Dominic said quietly. His voice was full of gratitude. For everything. Lila smiled softly, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. You're welcome, she said simply, knowing that no further words were needed. They stood there together in the fading light, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. And in that moment, both of them understood that things had changed, not just for one of them, but for both. And the change wasn't in what they could control, but in what they could give. The change that had quietly woven itself into the fabric of Dominic and Lila's lives now felt undeniable. It wasn't a grand transformation, but a gradual shift that had crept in slowly, unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by them both. The mansion, once a place where silence spoke volumes, now felt warmer, lighter, as though the very air was different between them. Neither of them could quite place it, but there was no denying the new understanding that hung between them. Dominic had long been a man who thrived on control. He had built his life on the idea that power was the only true strength. But Lila had shown him, through her quiet strength and unwavering kindness, that power wasn't always about dominance. It was about giving, about caring, about being there for others without asking for anything in return. It was a lesson Dominic had never expected to learn, and it had changed him in ways he wasn't sure how to articulate. The weight of it lingered in his chest as he walked the halls of the mansion, trying to make sense of the man he was becoming. He no longer felt the need to prove himself, to assert his control over everything. He had learned that there was strength in vulnerability, in opening up to others, and, most importantly, in allowing others to see him for who he truly was. It wasn't easy for him. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, walls made of power and wealth, that it was difficult to tear them down. But he was trying, and it was because of Lila that he was beginning to see what truly mattered. Lila, for her part, had never been one to seek change. She had always been content in her role, quietly serving the Castellano family, never asking for anything more than to do her job well. But Dominic's words, his respect, had begun to change her, too. She had never thought much about her place in the world or in the mansion. She had done what she was asked, fulfilled her duties, and kept her head down. But now, as she moved through the mansion, she couldn't help but feel different. It wasn't just about being seen or acknowledged. It was about being recognized for who she truly was, not just as the maid, but as someone who had quietly shaped the world around her with her kindness and care. The quiet strength she had always carried within her was no longer something she had to hide. Dominic had seen it, and in doing so, had given her the freedom to embrace it. One afternoon, as the autumn sun cast a golden light through the windows of the mansion, Lila found herself in the library, quietly organizing a few books on the shelves. The mansion was peaceful, the usual hum of activity from the staff absent, as many of them had finished for the day. As Lila straightened up, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his usual commanding presence softened by the warmth of the afternoon light. He stood there for a moment, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Lila," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity that had become more familiar in recent weeks. "I've been thinking again." She smiled softly, a quiet acknowledgement that she had become used to these moments with him. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "About everything," Dominic replied, taking a few steps closer. "About the changes, about how I've seen you, about how I've seen myself. About everything that's happened in the past few months." He paused, his gaze shifting away for a moment before meeting hers again. "You've shown me something, Lila. Something I never thought I needed to learn." Lila's heart skipped a beat at his words. She hadn't expected this conversation, but she could feel the weight of his sincerity. She waited for him to continue. "I've spent my entire life thinking that power, control, were the only things that mattered. But you've shown me that there's more. You've shown me that strength comes from kindness, from caring, from being there for others, without asking for anything in return." Dominic's voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his words that made Lila's heart ache. "And I've been wrong," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, but I can't ignore it anymore. You've changed me, Lila. You've helped me see the world in a way I never thought possible." Lila didn't know how to respond. She had never expected this from him. Not the apology, not the admission. It was something she had never allowed herself to hope for. And yet, here it was. She had never needed his recognition, but hearing him say this felt like something she had always quietly wished for. "You didn't need to change for me, Dominic," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't need to do any of this." Dominic stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "But I wanted to. For you. And for me. I wanted to become a better man. Not just for you. But for myself. For the life I want to lead. For the people I want to care for." Lila stood still, processing his words, the weight of them sinking in. She had never expected to hear this from him. But now that it was out in the open, she could feel the truth in his words. He wasn't the same man who had walked into her life months ago. The man standing before her now was someone different, someone who had learned, who had grown, who had found strength in vulnerability. "I see you, Lila," Dominic said softly, his voice steady. "And I want you to know that I will never forget what you've taught me. I won't forget the strength you've shown me." Lila felt something shift within her, a quiet release of everything she had held inside for so long. She had always known that her strength came from her ability to care for others, to give without asking for anything in return. But hearing Dominic's words, hearing his acknowledgement, made her realize that she was finally seen for who she truly was. "Thank you, Dominic," Lila said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me." Dominic smiled at her, his gaze warm and genuine. "No, thank you, Lila," he replied, "for showing me what it means to be truly strong." And as the afternoon light bathed them both, the mansion around them felt like a quiet reflection of the changes within them. Neither of them needed to speak further. The understanding between them was clear. They had both changed, not because they had to, but because they had found something deeper within themselves and within each other. The weeks rolled by, and with each passing day, the bond between Dominic and Lila continued to grow stronger. It was a quiet kind of change, but it was undeniable. They had both shifted, not just in how they saw one another, but in how they saw themselves. Dominic had spent his life as the man in control, the powerful Mafia boss who commanded respect through fear. But with Lila, he had learned that true strength wasn't about dominance. It was about vulnerability, about giving, and about connecting with others on a deeper level. He no longer sought control. Instead, he sought understanding and peace. Lila, for her part, had always been content in the shadows, quietly doing her job without asking for anything. But Dominic's respect had given her the space to realize her own worth. She no longer felt invisible. She was seen, not just as the maid, but as someone who had quietly shaped the world around her with her strength and kindness. The mansion, once filled with the hum of activity and the unspoken distance between them, now felt quieter. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of something more profound, something that neither of them had expected, but both had embraced. One evening, as autumn settled into the mansion, Lila found herself walking along the long hallway that led to the back garden. The air was cool, crisp, and the fading light of the sun cast soft shadows against the walls. She paused for a moment, taking in the stillness around her. There was a sense of peace here now, a peace she hadn't realized she'd been searching for. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic coming toward her, his usual confident stride softened by the calm of the evening. When he reached her, he stopped for a moment, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity that she had come to recognize. "Lila," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking." She nodded, her heart racing slightly. She was used to him speaking in a way that demanded attention, but tonight, his voice was different, gentler, more reflective. "About what?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of curiosity. "About us," Dominic replied simply, his gaze not leaving hers. "About everything that has happened between us." Lila felt a quiet flutter in her chest at his words. She wasn't sure what he meant, but something in his tone told her that this was important. "I've realized that everything I thought I knew about strength, about power, was wrong," he continued, his voice steady but filled with something softer than usual. "You've shown me that there is strength in kindness, strength in vulnerability, strength in being able to give without expecting anything in return. I never understood that before, but now because of you I do." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that Dominic had power, power over people, over situations, but she had never seen him like this. He was speaking of something that seemed so far removed from the man he had once been, the man she had always known. He was speaking of something real, something deeply human. You've changed me, Lila. Dominic continued, his voice softer now. You've shown me a different kind of strength. And for that, I'm grateful. More than I could ever express. Lila didn't know how to respond. She had never asked for his gratitude, never expected anything from him. But hearing him speak with such sincerity, with such vulnerability, made her realize how far they had both come. She had never imagined that Dominic, the powerful Mafia boss, would be standing here, admitting that he had learned something from her. I don't need anything from you, Dominic, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I appreciate that you see me, that you understand me. Dominic's expression softened, and for a moment, he just looked at her, really looked at her. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as the maid, not as the servant, but as a person with her own strength, her own dignity. I see you, Lila, he said quietly, his voice full of warmth. I see you for who you are, and I've learned that there's nothing more valuable than that. Lila's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words, the sincerity behind them, made something inside her shift. She had never needed his approval, never needed his recognition, but hearing it from him, hearing him say that he saw her, truly saw her, made her feel something she hadn't realized she had been missing. She was no longer invisible. You've always been there for me, Dominic continued, his voice quiet but steady. And for that, I can never thank you enough. Lila felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had always given, always done what was asked of her without expecting anything in return. But hearing him acknowledge it, hearing him speak of the impact she had on his life, made her realize how much she had truly given, without even knowing it. I've always done my job, she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. Because it's what I believe in. Because it's what's right. Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. And that's what makes you different, he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. You've shown me what it means to truly care for someone, to give without expecting anything. That's strength, Lila. That's the kind of strength I never knew I needed. Lila felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She had never asked for this, never expected it. But here she was, standing in front of Dominic, a man who had once been unreachable, and for the first time, she realized that they had both found something in each other that they hadn't known they were looking for. Thank you, Dominic, Lila said quietly, her voice steady. For seeing me. For understanding me. Dominic smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was a smile that spoke of something more than just gratitude. It spoke of something deeper, something they both shared now. Thank you, Lila, he said softly. For everything. And in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the stillness of the mansion, they both understood that their lives had changed, not because of what they had, but because of what they had learned from each other. The journey they had taken, though subtle and slow, had brought them to a place where they could finally see each other, not through the lens of power or expectation, but as two people, equal in their strength, equal in their vulnerability, and equal in their ability to give.